Thank you very much to everyone for coming along this morning. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar on learning from lockdown, the future of work after COVID-19. For those of you that don't know me, and I can certainly see some familiar names on the list, my name's Emma Parry. I'm a Professor of Human Resource Management at Cranfield School of Management, and I'm also the head of the Changing World of Work group at Cranfield. And this is the first of what we hope will be an interesting series of webinars that we are going to be putting together from the Changing World of Work group. I'm really pleased to welcome today to join me on our first webinar, Jo Swinson. Most of you will know Jo as the previous leader of the Liberal Democrat Party, but we're really keen to work with her in the Changing World of Work group because of her long history on working on policy related to work and employment as a business minister. She's been, I think it's fair to say, a champion of gender equality, both as an MP, but also personally, and through her book, which I will admit not to have read yet, Jo, Equal Power and How You Can Make It Happen. And probably most notably known, I guess, as an MP for delivering policy on shared parental leave, which I'm sure there are a few of you out there that are very grateful for those efforts. Within the last few weeks, we've been really pleased to welcome Jo as a visiting professor to the Changing World of Work group and Cranfield University. We're hoping this webinar will be the beginning of a fruitful collaboration. And let me just say thank you to Jo for joining me today, and we're looking forward to a conversation for the next hour.
Absolutely, looking forward to it.
Okay, so what are we going to do? So what we wanted to do is keep this webinar relatively informal. So Jo and I are both quite good at chatting, people are telling us. So we're going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking all things future of work after COVID-19. And to give you our thoughts on what COVID-19 means for the future of work. But then we want to join you into that conversation. So as Graham said, what we would really like to do is ask you to type any questions that you have relating to the future of work, whether that's as an employer or relation to policy. Please type your questions into the chat box, and then we will steer our conversation for the second half or 2/3 of the session to your questions. So please do ask us some questions, or we will just be rambling for the last half an hour, I think. Okay, so just to start us off, I'm going to ask Jo a question, and really just to get your opinions, Jo, on what you think the most interesting implications of COVID-19 might be for the future of work.
Well, thanks very much, Emma. And just before I answer, can I say how delighted I am to be in this new role as a visiting professor at Cranfield University, and this is my sort of first engagement in that role. And it's a university that I remember working with on a variety of projects, not least when I was spearheading the Women on Boards initiative in government. That, of course, Cranfield is well known for all the work that's done by Professor Sue Vinicum and others about women on boards and the regular statistics that come out, along with advice about what can be done to accelerate progress. So it's really particularly pleasing to have this collaboration with an institution that I've always respected and already had such positive experiences with. I mean, the last few months have been, for all of us, unprecedented. And I think what is worth just noting is that it's been in the context of something horrendous. This pandemic that has been claiming lives, that has been creating fear, that people have been worried about their health, their well-being, that of others. And even where people have not themselves been a victim of COVID, the massive changes that have been wrought in our society and our economy have been incredibly difficult for many people to deal with. And at the same time, we've had the kind of world of work on top of that, trying to find a path through. Some people have found themselves out of work because of the impact on the economy. And others have found themselves finding it incredibly difficult to combine their work with increased feelings of anxiety, with increased feelings of isolation if they have been shielding or living on their own, or the opposite problem of that scale, which was the case in my household with two very young children. How on earth do you try and continue doing things when you have little children that are suddenly with you 24/7 in a way that I just don't think has been something that has been experienced for, I'm trying to think of the time in human history when, grandparental care or people down the road or whatever have not been able to be part of the childcare solution. So it has been very unprecedented, and that, has been worrying. But from that has come this, necessity being the mother of invention. So we have suddenly seen new ways of working, or ways that had been pioneered by some in terms of flexibility and home working, but perhaps had not been adopted by others. All of a sudden, we have to do it. And you know what? We find out that we can. Just like we find out that we can suddenly stop all planes from flying in the sky and you can have much better air quality. Actually, lots of jobs that people had said you can't possibly do these from home. Turns out, yes, you can, largely do them from home, with the context of all of the constraints that I mentioned that have made things more difficult. So I think the opportunity that we have from this, because it's important to take what positive things we can out of a very negative situation, what we have now is an opportunity to try to reshape the way in which we do things, with that catalyst of having tried lots of different things and broken down barriers and attitudes that had been a real obstacle to change.
I agree with you completely. I mean, I think if you just take working from home as an example, and there are some of my colleagues have been doing research in this area for a long time, but we've seen for a long time some real moves to improve employees' access to flexible working, including working from home. But actually, over the last 10 years, the levels of people working flexibly have stayed quite stable and quite low. I mean, I was looking at some figures the other day from the OECD that said that actually only, in around kind of 2018-19, only 11% of people were working from home some of the time, and only around 2% all the time. And then as you said, suddenly 5-6 months ago, that shot up, I think, to around 40% of people that were working at home.
Yeah.
I mean, that's massive. If you take into account that for some industries, that's 80%, and for some it's very low, of course.
Well, indeed. And, we've really suffered, I think, in the UK labour market from this presenteeism culture in so many organizations. Now, clearly there are some jobs that you need to be physically there in order to do it. My brother-in-law is an A&E doctor, and my goodness, he has been doing such an amazing job, as of all of those people working in our NHS and care services in the past few months. People who serve you at the till in the supermarket. Again, if you're going to buy your groceries, then there need to be people physically there. But so many jobs can be done remotely, and there has been this reluctance, almost as if people can't be trusted. And it speaks to a wider sort of view of management and leadership within organizations, which is about whether or not you are sort of looking over somebody's shoulder the whole time, checking their screen and monitoring their every move, or whether or not you are working with them to develop and having that relationship of trust that they're going to do a good job, that you're respecting them and you're providing them with valued work and valuing them as an individual. And I think some organizations do this very well, but in some other organizational cultures, it's still very much a kind of monitoring people on their metrics, like you see with some of the distribution center warehouses, where people, human resources, have almost been reduced to sort of units of production rather than being people.
Exactly. And actually, I was just reading a piece of research this morning that was based in a call center that was talking really about how things like presenteeism and some of the more negative, perhaps micromanaging type processes had actually moved online. And this was actually having a very negative effect on people in terms of burnout and stress, more so than it probably would in the office. So So this idea of actually, you know, changing mindset, I think, in terms of how you manage people, you know, it's not about visibility. It's not about what you see people doing. You know, this idea they're in their office with their head down. It's actually about thinking about their output.
Yeah.
You know, how do you deal with that as a manager? For some people, that's very difficult.
Well, it is. And I think the other concept that we have shied away from in this country, not just in the labour market, but generally, you know, in government, in policy making, in business, has been this concept of resilience. And, you know, we've kind of pared down and, you know, reduced costs or, you know, reduced spending on things and tried to get the maximum number of, you know, calls per hour out of people in a call center, or how many orders have been packed in a distribution center. And those kind of metrics, as data has become more available, have increased. Obviously, anyone that's worked in those roles and felt that pressure knows the kind of personal well-being cost of that kind of management by metrics, and it trying to be always reduced down. But what we haven't really appreciated is, you know, all of the things which then don't get measured. So if you're in one of those situations and you've got a colleague who's struggling with something or doesn't know how to do a particular bit, should you take a few minutes away from what you were doing to help explain it to them or to support them in some way? Well, actually, that is probably what's going to make for a more productive workplace. But if you have the tyranny of these numbers, then that encourages people, you know, not to do that. So I think we just need to recognize that data can be really valuable. I'm a big spreadsheet geek myself, but at the same time, you know, not everything can be reduced to a number, and that's where you need to have trust in the individuals, because, you know, when you sit down with your member of staff who, you know, actually maybe is showing some signs of stress or whatever, and you work through with them and you have that, you know, 25-minute conversation, that might have a huge impact on the way in which they feel supported in the workplace and how productive they are in the days and weeks to come. But it doesn't get measured anywhere.
Just building on that for a moment. I mean, one of the things I've noticed, you know, talking to employers throughout the last 5 or 6 months, is actually one of the things that they have struggled with quite a lot is that kind of perhaps less formal support that you're talking about. Because quite often in a physical workplace, that happens when you bump into someone in a corridor or you happen to knock on their office. You know, one of the things with interacting like we are now via Zoom, you know, is it formalizes everything to quite a big degree. And actually you have to arrange to talk to someone. There's much less of that informal, you know, I mean, I'm a WhatsApp fanatic, so I spend a lot of time talking to people in my team on WhatsApp, for example, but, you know, it does make some of that actually more difficult.
It is, and I think it's one of the things that clearly the job of a manager has changed a bit during lockdown, because it is about thinking through how this new way of working has been impacting your employees. What's better about it? You know, really great advantages, people not having to commute, the time and the stress that is then taken away, because we know so much research shows that, you know, long commutes are very bad for people's well-being, and instead they might have been able to, you know, go for a walk, you know, for a short time in the morning to, you know, get their heart rate up and, you know, have some nice fresh air. Much better way to start the day. But equally, if people's home office environments, not everyone has somewhere that they can call an office. If you're living in a shared house and you basically have your bedroom that you then are working in and sleeping in, and, you know, you get that cabin fever and you feel that invasion of privacy if you know, go onto a Zoom call and, you know, the backdrop is basically your bed. I mean, you know, all of those things have a real impact on people, and the managers have had to understand the way that is impacting their team, and what are the informal mechanisms that can be put in place. So I've seen, you know, in some workplaces where they used to all go to the pub on a Friday and have a drink, you know, they've got a Friday afternoon quiz that they do on Zoom, where they have more informal chat. Someone else I know, she runs a small comms business. You know, they finally, about a month ago, managed to do a socially distanced meetup, and, you know, actually spend some time face to face in an outdoor setting, but have some of those conversations that they'd really missed. And I think it is important that, you know, people think about how those informal support mechanisms can be put in place, and the time that is needed to do that. You know, if we're working in a pandemic, you know, from home, we shouldn't expect the same level of productivity with everything else that is going on. And sometimes that will mean a reduction of expectations of output. And where that doesn't happen, that really can add to a huge pressure for people and cause that burnout.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, in my experience, again, from talking to people, I think we've seen this real shift or this journey that some employers have been through, where in the early days, it was all about productivity. You know, how can we still get the work done? How can we ensure business as usual when we're all working from home? And then that's moved to actually a realization that perhaps something needs to give. You know, things need to be done differently. And I think in the last couple of months, we've seen much more of a focus on, you know, on issues around kind of well-being, burnout, mental health, you know, this idea of Zoom fatigue that no one had ever even thought of until a few weeks ago. That's very real in my experience.
Well, absolutely. And I think the other thing that's quite interesting now is, you know, for anyone that thinks that the last few months have been, you know, the best experiment of what home working is actually like, you know, I don't think that is true at all with all of those constraints that have been there, and particularly for people who have children. And I appreciate that's not everyone within the workplace, but, you know, we've got schools already back in Scotland, going back kind of now or, you know, in the next few days in England. And, you know, that is finally for a big chunk of the workforce going to mean that they are not, you know, managing that juggle during their work of also looking after their children, and for a good chunk of that time, you know, trying to do what they could to support the homeschooling. So, you know, you can't measure your home working efficiency on the basis of what's it like when people are not just working from home, but doing that additional job of childcare as well. And, you know, I think there's another element to this, which is, you know, being increasingly well documented, is the impact, the gendered impact of that, because it hasn't been equally split between men and women, even in couples where both men and women are working. Women have borne the brunt of the job losses so far. They have borne the brunt of the additional, you know, childcare, in terms of they are spending more time doing that and more likely to be furloughed, etc. So, so that, you know, there's some inequalities there, which, you know, might well be a lasting legacy of the pandemic, despite the fact that there's other elements which ought to make things better for people who have caring responsibilities in the workplace by making it more accessible to work flexibly and to work from home.
So do you think moving forward, and I agree completely, I mean, in academia, we've seen some evidence that actually women have been much less productive than men in terms of publications, which is not everything we do in academia, obviously, than men, you know, presumably because they're taking the brunt of the caring and home responsibilities. I guess one of the questions with that is, moving forward with the children obviously having gone back to school this week in most cases, you know, do you think that will change? Will we start seeing some benefits to women through the kind of increased home working, or not?
Well, I mean, it's always hard to generalize, but I think if there's going to be a kind of assessment of what the home working is like and how it differs, then I think you can only really do that in the circumstances where you are free of those distractions and those other calls in your time, and that you're working from home in a way that you would be working in the office, but you're just doing it in a different location. So I think it will be a better experiment, if you like, of you know, how home working can work, and that, you know, obviously ought to be helpful for people who have, you know, other responsibilities on their time. Equally, you know, it opens up the labour market to many people who, for example, have disabilities that mean that, you know, commuting can be difficult, or indeed that the flexibility of being able to work in smaller bursts for some people who have conditions that, you know, it's very difficult to do, you know, 8 hours straight. So, you know, we ought to be able to get benefits from this different way of working. My fear is that the wider employment prospects, which obviously are looking pretty stark for the next few months, particularly as the furlough scheme and support for jobs comes to an end, the danger is that we end up with existing inequalities with groups that are already marginalized and in lower paid occupations and with higher rates of unemployment, whether, that's women, whether that's people from Black or minority ethnic backgrounds, whether that's people with disabilities. There's lots of different groups that already face barriers and discrimination in the workplace. When you have very low unemployment, then those things become still problematic, but less so, because the opportunities are greater. As you restrict the opportunities and the number of applicants per job skyrockets, then there's a real danger that we go backwards.
Yeah, and I mean, I've said to you before, Joe, one of my biggest worries is actually, having over the last few years seen a real emphasis on good work or decent work, with the Taylor report and some other initiatives that have kind of pushed forward, it's kind of good contracts, that actually we see a return to some of these more negative practices, perhaps, that are difficult for employees, such as 0 hours contracts and free internships and some of these other things, because we have a labour market that's much more open.
Absolutely. And in the times when employers can recruit very easily, there's less of a market pressure, if you like, for them to make sure that they are valuing each employee. Now, I mean, good employers will recognize the benefits of doing that in terms of still getting the best talent, of retention of staff, because there's still massive costs of changing staff and having to retrain. But there's no doubt there will be employers that look for the opportunity to slash costs to the bone, to not treat their employees well, and it's easier for them to get away with it. And in those times, it's more important that you have the regulatory structures that are there to protect people. And obviously, we have some elements like the minimum wage, which provide a floor, but some of the changes that I think we'd hope to see from the government through the Taylor review, through additional protection in some of the changes that were mooted at the end of Theresa May's tenure on supporting parents in the workplace and so on. It's unclear whether those will still be taken forward under this government, because those initiatives have sort of gone into the treacle of government, and whether they come out the other side is still not certain. It doesn't necessarily seem that this is where the priority of the government lies when you look at the actions of the Equalities Secretary on the gender pay gap reporting, which obviously was supposed to be reported in April, and a few days before the deadline it was announced that there would be no enforcement action taken against anyone that didn't report. Now, by the time at which that announcement was made, the work had largely been done to produce these reports. So the only impact that had was that people felt they didn't need to publish it. It didn't actually save them the work of calculating it. But now only half of those organisations have published. So I think that is perhaps a signal that this government might not be as positive about those mechanisms within the workplace to support and protect workers as even Theresa May's government was, because she did make that quite a cornerstone of what she wanted to achieve, even though it didn't go all the way through to fruition.
Okay, and while we're talking about government initiatives, I mean, I think in the last week we've seen this real tension between, kind of working from home, still a lack of childcare in many quarters, and then some government pressure, certainly at least in the media, for people to return to the office so that your sandwich shop gets the business or whatever. I mean, this morning I hear there are now signs on the tube stations, basically promoting what it's like to be back in the office. So what, what's your thoughts about that? What will we see moving forward?
I think it is quite fascinating the way in which the return to the office has been much less much less taken up in this country than in other countries. And I think there's probably a variety of reasons for that, about what trust people have in the messages that have been coming out and how safe people feel. But I also think it's interesting that the sandwich shops are the ones that are sort of getting the in the city centres the kind of the interest of the government, because presumably when people are working from home, yes, they might be more likely to eat their lunch at home, but I'm sure that during lockdown, what we have seen as the city centres have been quieter, that, you know, the surrounding towns and suburbs and those business outlets have benefited from the fact that people have been less likely to, you know, get on a train and travel and spend the money in a city centre. And I think there's just an interesting question there about, you know, what is most valuable. I mean, we're currently set up for these city centres to be, you know, the hub at the place where everybody goes. But if we do move towards, and, you know, in this age of increasing technology, if we do move towards an age where even if offices reopen, people aren't in them 5 days a week, you go in for specific meetings and team building and so on, then actually that wider environment, people being more dispersed in a range of different towns and suburbs and so on, you know, is that necessarily a bad thing? You know, yes, city centres will need to reinvent themselves in a way, but why is that inherently bad? And I just think that's quite fascinating. But the other thing, which of course has been from a flexibility perspective exacerbated, is, you know, this 9 to 5 mentality, you know, the concept of rush hour, which it makes no sense in a pandemic. And so I think it's another way in which the idea that everybody needs to be working the same hours will recede, because if people are going into the office, they still might prefer to, you know, to go in much earlier, or to go in at 10:30 when the public transport will be quieter, and maybe stay a bit later or go home and then do some more work from home. So we ought to be able to have a better, more efficient use of the existing public transport networks that we have, which have previously had to cope with this ridiculous kind of rush hour twice a day, not had sufficient capacity, but then been underused at other points.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, one of the things that we haven't had over the last few months that I think you're talking about is the element of choice in where and when we work, you know, and I'm a big supporter of the idea that actually we should be able to choose. I mean, when I listen to people talking about 4-day weeks, I think, well, actually that might just replicate the problem in fewer days. Actually, it should be about how we work in different ways and different places and different hours, whether that's over 4 days or 5, more than actually it is about, you know, how many days we end up working.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, well, I mean, there's so much within that, you know, is interesting about how things need to change. And, you know, why did we end up with a 5-day working week and, you know, these hours? And it, you know, it dates back to car production in the early 1900s, you know, so the idea that, you know, that's how we ought to be organising our workplace in the age of the internet just makes no sense, and hasn't made sense for decades. Finally, it seems that we're being forced to wake up to that fact. And I think there is a question about, you know, what should the split be? You know, in the UK, we notoriously work, you know, very long hours. You know, is that what people actually want? Is that what people feel is required? And perhaps the other thing that the pandemic has showed us is, you know, the value of all those other things. You know, whether it's the childcare and the, you know, the cleaning that in many households had been outsourced, you know, in to the paid sector, that had to come back in house literally during the pandemic, and, you know, the additional kind of stress and burden that placed when people were trying to do their existing jobs. Perhaps that made us, I mean, I certainly always had great respect for my child's, you know, educators and carers, but let's just say that, you know, I've emerged from lockdown having tried to homeschool, you know, one child while looking after a toddler, and I have, you know, even higher enhanced respect for those people who manage to do it with a class of 30 children at once, you know, goodness knows how. So you know, I think the way in which we value different jobs, you know, did change during lockdown, and should, I hope, be a legacy of this. You know, what were the lists of the key worker occupations? You know, it wasn't advertising executive, you know, it wasn't even necessarily chief executive of you know, whatever organization. You know, it was social care workers, it was health workers, it was delivery drivers, it was retail workers, people working in food production, people who are cleaners. Many of these are jobs which are low paid, low valued in our society, disproportionately often done by women, by Black people, by people who, you know, are low pay. These are jobs which do not often attract high salaries. And yet, when push came to shove and we were in, you know, a crisis, these were the jobs that we could not afford to have people not do, and that those people had to go and face the risks. You know, the number of bus drivers in London who died was, you know, it's a very disproportionate risk that they were taking on, and yet they continued to do that so that key workers could get to work. And if that doesn't make us reassess how we are valuing different roles in our society and our workplace, then I think something's gone wrong. You know, these should not be seen as low-skilled jobs.
So how would you change that? I mean, with, you know, from a policy perspective, how would you change that moving forward? Because I mean, I agree, we have seen a bit of a change in mindset, but then how do you change that structurally within our society?
Well, I mean, one of the barriers that has been in place has bluntly been people's ability to pay through taxation or other methods for things like social care. And it's already a challenge as to how do we fund social care, and it's something where, you know, the nettle has not been grasped for such a long time. And bluntly, one of the reasons for that is, you know, generally until it comes to be one of our, you know, own relatives, you know, many people will rate that quite low in their assessment of what's important. And I think hopefully that is changing a bit, and those changed attitudes might open up some scope for raising, you know, the wages, increasing the training, trying to make sure that these become roles that people go into and are supported to develop in and to stay in, and to have to also have a more continuous connection with the people that they're caring for. Because many people who've got an elderly relative and are navigating the social care system will say that's one of the great frustrations. But, you know, when you're paying very, very low wages and the conditions are hard, you know, this is a hard job to do, physically hard often, and also emotionally hard to be able to provide the pastoral support that somebody needs while meeting their care needs. You know, no wonder many people don't necessarily, you know, stay in that profession if they then move on to something else that is going to pay them more money. So part of this is about the economics and the amount of money that we pay people. But I think this is something it's worth us addressing, because, you know, there's a lot of trends going on in our labour market, one of which is increasing automation, and what number of industries are going to be affected. You know, for all of these people who are currently delivery drivers, right? You know, that has been a massive increase in terms of roles during the last few months. And, you know, maybe the final mile will still continue to be something for some time to come. But, you know, how many years away is it in terms of, you know, long distance freight and haulage that will still require human drivers? You know, driverless cars, there's still issues and problems with them, but are we really sitting here and saying that in, whether it's in 25 years, you know, those won't have been resolved? It feels like there's a direction that is going in. And that's just one area that there's going to be a massive change. Something that's really hard to automate is care. You know, we do not want, when we are ill, a robot to hold our hand, right? We might have some support in a, you know, robotic hoist that makes the physical challenge of moving elderly people easier, but they're still going to want that human connection. So this is going to be, with an aging population, a growth sector. It makes sense for us to properly value it and properly find that economic model for it. And bluntly, our labour market has not been getting that right.
Okay, as everyone can tell, Joe and I think, could talk about this stuff for ages, but as I've been listening to you, Joe, I've been seeing the questions also clocking up on my screen. So maybe we should turn to some of the questions at this point. Okay, so maybe I'll start at the top, and there's a few things that overlap there, but we'll start at the top. So Alex is asking, as going back to working at home and working remotely, as companies become more comfortable with staff working remotely, do you think there's a chance that more roles will be outsourced to cheaper jurisdictions?
I think there is. I think, you know, it's a chance, and it depends on the role, and there's sort of factors that work in different ways. I'm reminded of a story of I'm trying to remember where I read it now, of a guy in the past that had been in America and had a role, I think, as software development, and had very you know, enterprisingly basically outsourced himself to people in other countries. He had paid them, and he had then submitted that work to his employer, and they'd paid him more for it, and he basically you know, enjoyed the difference. But you know, eventually you know, it was concluded that, you know, he wasn't actually needed to do that. So I think there's a genuine danger that if you know, if roles are entirely done virtually, then they can be done from anywhere, and that can be quite challenging in many labour markets, and the implications of that need to be considered. But equally, I think one of the things we've all recognised from Zoom fatigue is that although technology is a great enabler, you do still want to be able to have face-to-face time with your colleagues. So I suspect that there will still be that connection through place, even if it's just not an everyday connection in physical form. And so I think there will be more that will be done online and done virtually, but I don't think it will negate the desire that people have to physically meet with the people that they're working with, and to have those brainstorms and those sessions and those celebrations, and working through difficult problems, and, you know, doing some of that stuff, you know, actually in person.
It's interesting though, because I've had conversations with a couple of people recently thinking about, I guess, hiring what you might call talent, so the hard to find skills. And actually, with a couple of the employers that I've spoken to, the fact that they've now got used to not being co-located with people, as means that actually they've been hiring people that are from Australia, or, you know, from Asia, from other countries. So this idea of kind of digital nomads, if you like, that people can work anywhere, and then we can recruit talent from anywhere because it doesn't need to be physically located with us. You know, completely anecdotally, I'm seeing a bit of a rise in, you know, kind of a mindset that that's more possible.
I mean, I think it will be an increasing trend. I remember a tech company I worked with in Glasgow, and, you know, the challenge that they had to find software developers, and the team was very very dispersed around the world, and that was partly as a, you know, a challenge of you know, visa regimes to get people physically into the country, but they just worked around that, and they had somebody working in Turkey and somebody else in South America. And I think in those digital environs, then people are more used to it anyway, but it will, I think this will mean that it spreads out a bit more. So yeah, I think it will be a trend that will be with us, but I just think it's not going to be as you know, as immediate as that.
No, and I guess that's true probably from all of these trends. You know, the idea that no one will ever go to an office again is, you know, something that's been touted around, but I guess is unlikely. With that in mind, Chris is asking, should we be legislating that requests to workers home are accepted by default? Because at the moment they have to be considered, of course, under law, but not accepted, unless employers can justify otherwise.
Well, that is kind of the existing law, though I suppose, you know, employment lawyers, there might be some of this on this particular webinar, could probably have all sorts of discussions about this. But basically, the employer currently has to have a reasonable business reason for refusing a request to work flexibly, and working from home can of course be an example of a request to work flexibly. And I mean, I think what might have happened is that the sort of window of what seemed to be reasonable will have moved. So what you might have been able to justify as, you know, well, that's just impossible because people need to be here, and you know, I think this will have changed it. One thing I think is interesting for employers, though, that is a challenge that I think we're about to face that we haven't had in lockdown, is it is actually quite straightforward to do engagement with people through Zoom or whatever software you're using when everybody is dialing in, you know, on their laptop. It's much harder when some of the team are physically in the office and sat around a table, and some people are dialing in. And anyone that's done the old conference call with a sort of spider phone in the middle will know that when you've dialed in, it's quite hard to get the body language of what's happening, because when we're in a room together, we talk over each other, we bounce off each other more. And so I don't think, actually, I think there's a room here for, you know, tech entrepreneurs to find some kind of solutions that make this easier, where people can, you know, have microphones plugged in if they're in a room, and that that means it's easier to pick up, and that, you know, people who are dialing into such a Zoom call don't just get one little small bit of their screen with 4 people round a table, but you could perhaps still have the individual pictures. I'm not sure if that exists yet, but I think we will need to, and employers will need to think quite carefully about how that is done. Even if they've got people in the office, you know, to do that meeting, is it better sometimes to have those people in different parts of the office and still doing it via the online software? And part of that might be trial and error, but I think that is a coming challenge, that hybrid office plus remote.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. And having been one and both ends in those meetings, it is very challenging. So I would agree with that completely. Going back to your points about gender, Janie is asking, and I think this is an important point, about how women can be better supported in relation to home working, either in relation to childcare or other employee rights, or other solutions that could, you know, get rid of some of these barriers with caring responsibilities and other challenges, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think for women who have caring responsibilities, you know, there being that social care in place and that childcare in place, you know, is probably the single biggest thing that makes the difference. And, you know, I think it's been, you know, quite frustrating for many people to see the kind of exhortations for people to go back to the office and so on when, you know, childcare settings weren't opened. And, you know, it's been very much hit and miss. I mean, you know, I have to say, love my children though I do, I absolutely cheered when the nursery reopened. But I know that I've got friends whose, you know, whose nurseries didn't reopen in the same way or at the same time. So just recognizing, you know, how fundamental that is, because at the end of the day, if you are trying to, you know, stop a small child getting into mischief that is dangerous for them, and the constant, you know, requests, I mean, we can all see, and, you know, we've all experienced those like slightly cute moments where a child comes onto a call and says hello to everyone, and that's all very well, but we know that they're not angels the whole time. So so I think making sure that childcare is in place is and elder care, when it's, you know, revolving around older people where there's care responsibilities, is vital. But I think the other thing here is this interesting issue of the role of men. Men have increased the amount of time they spent doing childcare and housework and chores during lockdown. I hope some of that will, you know, will continue and start to be part of a trend. But, you know, we still see, you know, relatively low rates of take up of shared parental leave. We still saw that it was the kind of default position for many was that the woman would take on the lion's share of those responsibilities. And, you know, ultimately that split within the home, you know, needs to become more equal. So, you know, paying, you know, paternity leave, you know, for longer, you know, these initiatives that will help, you know, encourage men to, and enable in many cases, because many men want to do this, but enable men to be more equal partners in the domestic sphere, I think is, you know, in the longer term, absolutely fundamental.
Okay, there's an interesting conversation emerging on the chat that which is still related to working from home. There's obviously lots of interest around this, but I guess it is one of the, you know, the main effects of COVID-19 for those of us that are, you know, based in an office most of the time. So Olga is asking, should the work from home 40-hour week be compensated the same way as office-based working hours that involves 1 to 2 hours daily commute on average, which makes me feel very guilty because it takes me 10 minutes to commute to Cranfield. And then a follow-up to that from Lynn, saying that this raises big questions about applying minimum wage or other wage regulations if people are working uneven hours, I guess, or, you know, kind of, you can't monitor those hours in the same way when they're at home.
I think they're really interesting. So I think the issue of compensation is fascinating. So you've got, I think, factors working in both directions. So many people will have experienced not only extra time in terms of not having to commute, but you know, often that's a costly thing to do as well. So the extra income. That said, people being at home, you know, we've had the summer months, but particularly going into the winter months, you know, all of the energy costs, the, you know, additional kind of, you know, almost if you like wear and tear, you know, being in your home and it having to serve, you know, 2 different functions. Some people will feel actually that they'd prefer to, you know, buy somewhere or rent somewhere bigger than they would have done if they weren't working from home. So, there's definitely additional costs in doing this. And some employers have made a point of saying that they have made a contribution to employees because, they're using their own broadband, which they're paying for. In some cases, they're then using their own technology. So I think, there are additional costs that come from it as well as savings. And of course, the whole pandemic issue, having a little bit of extra time. Well, frankly, if you're also trying to juggle, childcare or, extra responsibilities, it taking longer to get your groceries and so on because of all the queuing and everything, then actually much of that time gets eaten up anyway. But I would hope we don't see this as an opportunity for employers to say, well, we're going to cut your pay because you're not having to commute. The issue about how you calculate in terms of particularly minimum wage, I think there is a real danger there. And particularly if we saw a move towards, we've already seen this to some extent, just trying to have employees to cover your very busiest parts. So here's where the rush is. So we're going to give you a split shift where you're going to come in to work in the coffee bar for the breakfast, commute between, 7 and 10. And then we're going to say you can go home, but then come back in for the lunchtime rush between 12 and 2. And that already, that kind of model of split shift already existed, and certainly if people are on very low wages can feel quite exploitative. Whereas the real danger is that you have that exacerbated to a much greater degree where employers say, well, we only need you for these very specific points in the day, but yet you're kind of still not able to do exactly what you want with the rest of your time because you're tied to coming back for those parts of your shift. So I think this is an issue which is also about the power between employer and employee, or in some cases it will be worker if they're not having a full employee status. And I think that power dynamic is worryingly going to go in the direction of the employer, and they already have more of the power. And so what the government is able to do to bolster rights and also enforcement of those rights is important, and where the role of things like trade unions really ought to be quite vital, but increasing numbers of workers aren't covered by trade unions. So I think there's still a gap there in the labour market generally. I know the TUC have been trying to look at ways at which they can reach out to sectors that now don't have a lot of union representation and support people who are self-employed or working on a contractual basis. But yeah, this is an issue that is, I think, potentially going to be one of the ones that runs on and could become a problem.
I guess the whole idea of hours and the way that people are working when working from home is a massive issue and risk factor in relation to burnout and mental health, as I mentioned before. I think some research from the Institute for Employment Studies, which I'm an honorary fellow for, found that almost half of the people that responded to their survey said they were working longer and more irregular hours than they were before. That's a real risk factor for kind of stress and burnout, isn't it?
I think it totally is. And I think, I suppose I would also say, and with so many of these things, it's the same with 0 hours contracts. There's a group of people for whom they work brilliantly because the power dynamic is such that people are saying, I want that flexibility and I can, genuinely say yes or no to these contracts. Then you've got people who are in a very vulnerable situation who don't have much power at all. Again, if somebody, loves what they do and is working extra hours because they were commuting and they're really interested in it, that's perhaps less of a problem if it is truly discretionary, and it's more of an issue of creating a culture where people are encouraged to make time for their well-being. But in a jobs market where it is incredibly difficult to find work, and it is very competitive, then that additional pressure where people feel the need to do that, I think is worrying. And so part of this is about good rights and protections, and it's also partly, I think, cultural. It's perhaps the equivalent of presenteeism at home, right, where it used to perhaps be sending the late email, to kind of show that you've been working really hard and really late, and everybody sort of, oh, you sent an email at that time of night or that early in the morning. The kind of digital equivalent of the jacket on the back of the chair. How do we create a culture that is kind of a positive culture around working hours. And I think that has to be by valuing what people are doing outside of work and putting a real value on their well-being, and checking in with each other, and that being something which is acknowledged as being important.
I think that's really interesting, because I think some commentators have suggested that working from home should be the end of presenteeism, and yet actually I've completely anecdotally seen almost a new sort of presenteeism where people feel that they have to turn up for every meeting. I've heard of colleagues that are logged into 2 meetings at once because they feel as though they need to be present, because of this attitude that, well, you're at home, so why on earth can't you make the meeting? And so they feel as though actually they can't say they're busy and not be there. I mean, it's that kind of culture that we need to be eliminating.
Well, indeed, and because in a sense what you're doing is less visible, you're not physically in the office, that this is one of the ways to be visible. And I think leadership managers have a really important role to play here, to set the norms of what is understood, and what is, what people understanding, what they're being judged and assessed on, what they are expected to do, and therefore feeling relaxed. And sometimes it might be about not joining that particular meeting. And sometimes it might be as simple actually as, not necessarily having your camera on for all the meetings, or, I have to say, sometimes the merit of an actual phone call, not everything has to be a Zoom call. I've quite enjoyed sometimes being able to speak to somebody, give them perfectly enough attention, but simultaneously make a cup of tea. And, that's quite difficult to do when you're on Zoom, because that's very distracting. So that sort of feeling that you have to be, not just at your desk, but within this space of your desk, if you lean down to scratch your foot, people start to wonder what you've done. That is a different kind of presenteeism, and I think it probably can create significant stress, and people are on back-to-back Zoom calls all day.
I agree completely. So I've just noticed that someone from the Institute for Employment Studies is online. I should just say I didn't just mention your research because I noticed you. I didn't notice you until afterwards. So just moving away from working at home for a moment, because I'm aware we've only got a couple of minutes left, believe it or not. Kim is asking around the furlough scheme. When this comes to an end, it's anticipated that unemployment will skyrocket. I think we're all expecting that. So should the furlough scheme be extended, possibly by diverting resources from the government's job retention scheme, or by introducing a short-time working scheme such as the German scheme to retain jobs?
I mean, I think the prospect of, we're already going to have lots of job losses. There've already been a lot of job losses, but the prospect of having, I think there's 3 million people currently being supported by the furlough scheme. The idea that the majority of those people suddenly lose their jobs in one fell swoop at the end of October, it just doesn't bear thinking about. So, I understand there is a tension here within government between not being able to have the furlough scheme operate indefinitely. And I think the changes to enable some part-time working make a lot of sense, actually, because in some ways it would actually be stifling organisations that wanted to start getting back people back working, but weren't able to support them on a full-time basis. And the choice between a kind of furlough and can't do anything, or back full-time is not one that was helpful. So it may not be in its existing form, it might not be with the existing reach, but there is clearly some sectors that are still going to be unable to function as they normally would for some time to come. So I think the skill is going to be to work out how to provide that support. And, I've seen different, I think IPPR came out with some interesting ideas about how you could have some part-time support and, encourage people to keep workers on, even if it's not on a full-time basis, because, if you can protect those jobs, I think it feels to me like that is, a good way for the government to provide that support to the economy, because there is a chance that many of those jobs will then be able to continue as we hopefully start to come out of the other side of this, rather than jobs that are lost that might never return. But there's no doubt that this is going to be a delicate balancing act, and borrowing costs are really low right now, but I understand the argument that it being indefinite obviously doesn't work. It all ending in October doesn't seem like that will work either. It probably needs to morph and change a bit, perhaps being more targeted, perhaps being more focused on part-time.
And then just to add to that also from Kim, Kim's noting evidence that suggests that disabled people are particularly vulnerable to redundancy at the moment. You know, what do we need to do to protect those, you know, that segment of the labour market at the current time?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's a good example of where the protections are there in law, because obviously disability is a protected characteristic, but it is very hard for people to enforce their rights. And, you know, I've sort of long favoured it was something which, you know, I sort of came to the conclusion towards the end of my time as Employment Relations Minister that there does need to be more proactive support in enforcing employment rights. So the government does it, but only in very limited circumstances. So sometimes for agency workers and for the minimum wage. And we put a lot more resource into enforcing the minimum wage. We started naming and shaming companies, which the government's now suggested it's not so keen to do. But I think that's really important. And I think having some kind of proper, I think there's one individual that they have as a sort of director of labour market enforcement. I think having something that is more akin to the minimum wage enforcement scheme for particularly vulnerable workers to be able to access, so that it is done much more proactively, rather than relying on each individual to take employment tribunals. I think that scheme and that system is actually just flawed in its sort of intrinsic nature, because I don't think that many of these vulnerable individuals will feel able, even taking employment tribunal fees out of the picture, which have obviously been scrapped rightly, but even without that, many people will just not feel that that's something which they can take the risk of doing, or indeed the kind of the cost in terms of time and emotional energy. So I think government does need to have more of a role in enforcing rights for the most vulnerable people in our labour market.
Okay, brilliant. Well, it is 12 o'clock, believe it or not. I feel as though we could go for another hour, but I suspect people have other things to go to, including you, Joe. So just to say, fascinating conversation as far as I'm concerned, and lots of things that I think we could be researching in higher education and at Cranfield perhaps. Really some conversations that we should be getting out there in the policy world and with employers. So just to say a massive thank you to you, Joe. It's been a fascinating conversation, and welcome again to Cranfield in your visiting professor role.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you everybody for joining as well. There's some great comments in the chat. Sorry we didn't get to everything, but I'm sure this will not be the last occasion.
No, I'm sure it won't. It definitely won't, in fact. So just to say, we are, as I said at the beginning, this is the first in a series of webinars. We are running our second webinar on the 1st of October, just to do the advertising bit for a moment. Graham is putting some information on the screen now. Good timing, Graham, well done. So those of you that are HR people, you will probably have heard of Parry Timms, who is I think you know Parry Timms, in fact, Joe.
I do.
He knows you. So he's quite a big HR and OD thinker. He's one of our visiting fellows in the Changing World of Work and a good friend of mine. He's very lively, enthusiastic, full of energy. I'm sure anyone that knows him will agree. So I think this will be another great webinar. So please do come and join us for that. And we will publish the details of the other webinars as and when we have dates for them. And then just to say thank you again to the team, to Joe, and to everyone for joining us today. It's great to see everyone. Goodbye.